Welcome back to the Expat Files. I have a super special guest, a guy I met and got a chance to hang out with recently at a gathering in Dubai with a kind of mastermind that we're both part of. And it was just a marvelous experience, but I was so impressed. That's Alex Krainer, and what Alex has to say about what's going on and what Alex has written about and been a very outspoken voice in certain circles about what's taking place and sort of what's unfolding. This is a very valuable guest to have on right now. He has a really unique take on a lot of the events that are unfolding. So welcome, Alex. I'm super happy you made it. It's great to have you on.
Good to join you, Tane. Thank you for having me, and warm greetings to all your viewers and listeners.
Yes, and thank you for taking the time. I wanted to start with, you grew up in communist Yugoslavia. You have firsthand experience of and I think this of course comes as a shock to people, especially in the Western world, that a lot of things worked quite well in communism, right? A lot of the things that, like, I had I just ordered something. A package is coming from Colorado. It's going to take very near to 20 days to get here. They told me it would take between 2 and 10. Like, even the postal service is just a joke right now in the West. And some of the things that we're seeing happen that you never would have expected to have happen. You look at the different ways, and where I'm going with this is the different ways that society can be structured is obviously a wider debate than just, damn it, democracy at all costs and all the rest. And we're watching our societal systems break down, which is part of the unsettling feeling that is going on in the world right now. These institutions are very long in the tooth. We know historically that big upheavals come when corruption reaches a certain point, and the system's breaking down, right? Well, one of the things that you see very, very quickly when this kind of thing starts to happen in a so-called democratic setup is populism, and the rise of that. Obviously, the arrival of Donald Trump on the scene was a big, big wake-up call for a lot of people. But you have a long history with a very different structure of society and a lot to say about that. So please talk about your background, and what I want you to tell people about is this wonderful book that you wrote that's been banned. That's not very easy to get anymore. And maybe we can give people a way to get that if that's still possible. Talk about what your upbringing and your background and your perspective on what's happening East versus West, or West versus the rest, and sort of, where that led you, and maybe even, weave in your book and sort of what that was all about, and what were the consequences of your points of view thus far.
Yes, great questions, Tane, because this is not just an academic discussion. This has now become very highly relevant to the direction in which humanity evolves from this point. I grew up in the communist world, which kind of fell apart in 1991. When I was 21 years old. But up until then, communist world was where I grew up, where I lived, the system under which I was educated. And, apart from the ideology of, we actually had Marxism in school. Life in former Yugoslavia was actually very good. It was a well-ordered system, a well-ordered society. And, we were reasonably prosperous. The society was well organized. The infrastructure functioned well. Things like taking away trash, the water system, the sanitation system, the public health, postal service. All of these things worked remarkably well. In fact, just to give you an illustration. When I was in the army, and this was already in 1995, and I was stationed on an island, which was the southernmost island of the Adriatic Sea. It had one ferry connection to the mainland per day. And many of the soldiers in my unit were from northern Croatia, from a village in northern Croatia. And one day, their family sent them a jug of wine, a plastic container, 20 liters of wine, okay? So the way they sent it was this was a white plastic container. They wrote the address in blue marker on the side of this big white container. They turned it over to the post office. 48 hours later, we had the wine. And this is from a small village to a small village on an island that had only one day. So, like ordinary mail from a city to city would take half a day to a day for a nothing price. It was things like this, education system was quite good, rigorous in terms of natural sciences and so on. Yeah, they taught us Marxism as well, but we ignored that.
Was it? Yeah, well, that was my next follow-on question. Like, was it anywhere near as virulent? Because what you get today, and God help me, I'm ashamed to admit this, but I actually did a graduate school degree. It actually was very eye-opening. I say that tongue in cheek. I did a grad degree at an institution which is the most new age. It was an East-West psychology school in the Mission in San Francisco. This was 2005 to 8. I mean, it was a catastrophe even then on every level. I'm not going to go into it, but the level of just demonization of sort of straight white male America was so virulent even at that time. And my whole sense of the thing was not that I personally was being persecuted, although I was, right? I actually had to file a lawsuit to get them off my back so I would be allowed to graduate over completely ridiculous things. This is why I'm not going to rehash it. But the whole sense of the feeling at the university was we must cater to the lowest common denominator because we don't want to offend anybody. And it's like the damage that does to people who are striving, who are ambitious, like who have ideas that they want to push and explore, which is what universities used to be. How bad was Marxism? You say you guys all just sort of took it and like, yeah, whatever, right? Like everybody just kind of ignored it because it's a failed philosophy, no?
It wasn't bad at all. The contrast with today's Western world is that there were no artificially contrived hysterias that are being whipped up on a permanent basis. Right. We were obliged to take Marxism in school, but it was so obvious that the system didn't work. We were promised, like socialism was going to be this transition period into communism, and then communism was going to be utopia. But it was so obvious that, people in the West under capitalism were more prosperous than us under socialism. And so it was obvious that the system wasn't working, that we were actually, with time, we were moving in the opposite direction of what was promised. So, we as kids who, we watched British sitcoms and we listened to British and American pop groups and rock groups and all this. And so, we had some idea about the Western world. And we were, in former Yugoslavia, we were free to travel. So many of us did. In fact, my family and my family friends and we would go once a year for a week skiing either to Italy or to Austria. So this was, it was, you could see, it wasn't a secret. So, in class, we would debate our professors and they would say like, blah, 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 this. And then we would say like, well, that's not how it is, really, is it?
How it is in St. Moritz, buddy. Yeah, right.
Yeah. And there wasn't, the professors would humor us. They weren't like, no, you must, you will be punished. They tried to persuade us, but it didn't work.
Right. And
so, I'm not going to, I wouldn't go as far as praising the system, because it was unsustainable, and what's unsustainable eventually collapses. But it wasn't it wasn't any more unsustainable than the Western system that we call capitalist now.
Yes.
It had the same rot from the same origin baked into its foundation, which is the fractional reserve banking with the currency, with fiat currency. Same. The only the main difference that people need to appreciate between communism and capitalism is that in countries that we call socialist or socialist countries, government intervention flows bottom up, meaning governments are generous with the population, with the ordinary people in terms of generous social benefits, pension plans, free healthcare, free education, a lot of investment in public infrastructure, parks, playgrounds, things like this. Whereas in countries that we call capitalist countries today, you have the same government intervention in the economy. You don't get away from that, but it tends to flow mostly top down, meaning that the government splurges on large corporations, giving them no compete contracts, the military industrial complex, the big pharma, the big ag, the big even the big media, big tech, and all of these kinds of businesses. So they get privileged treatment from the government, whereas the ordinary people get a minimum of support. So that's the that's mainly the difference between the two systems. What's common to both systems is that the government intervention happens in the capitalism and in the socialism in all across the world.
That's interesting. Two things about that. Well, first of all, that the common denominator is central bank fiat currency.
Yes.
And that it's rotten. that because obviously, I worked for the wonderful Bill Bonner for a number of years. I actually worked with him on his last book promotion. He's somebody that I've read for a number of years. Nobody's done a better job, Monday to Friday, day in, week out for the last 20 plus years, just writing about this dreadful, dreadful lie that the entire societal structure is predicated on, which is, and David Webb, one of our colleagues that we know and whose work has been quite prominent in recent months, I would say, on The Great Taking. If you haven't read David Webb's excellent book, you can get it free online. It's just excellent. It's very well written, very easy to read. The conversation he had recently with G. Edward Griffin, the author of Creature from Jekyll Island, and very well-known figure to a lot of folks too, was, and they start the conversation as David, and I'm paraphrasing here, he says, imagine a scenario where there's a group of very select insiders who collect interest off of a bunch of fake money that they've created. And they get to do this over and over again, year after year after year. And to the point where they're so wealthy, all they're doing is collecting interest. And then again, and this is partly your point that I thought was fascinating, they use that money to go start projects and do a lot of things that nobody wants, like war and, all of the different things. I mean, just rewinding what you said at the start of this conversation, I mean, postal service, sanitation, medical coverage, schools, like we in the West now, in the Western world, I don't think I struggle to think of any place where any of those services are handled well at all, right? You can't find any place where you're really satisfied, like what a good job, the local municipal government is doing at X, Y, and Z. It doesn't exist. It doesn't exist anywhere that I know of. And it just continues to grow worse almost by the day. I had to take my son to the laboratory today to get a quick test, and just the level of aggravation and frustration. And it's like, we can't do better than this, really? So, and then the second piece is, this thing about government largesse. It's like, is it a problem that the government is so free-handed? Like, in other words, is it better that they were free-handed with the population, as you said, from the bottom up in the socialist system? Obviously, we know what it's like now, right? These anti-competitive practices and the protectionism. Boeing is allowed to prevent Airbus from selling a bunch of planes in the United States, for example. And lo and behold, right, doors and landing gear are falling off Boeing airplanes. That's a completely predictable outcome of all of this kind of largesse and protectionism and financialization of really vital institutions. Are both of them equally bad? I guess it's not. I don't want to derail and just talk about this, but I'm fascinated because one of the things that I tried to bring up in Dubai, I talked about the difference in Eastern and Western cognitive practices, or historically, right? How the two societies have viewed the world differently, and one of those things that is sort of resonates with or pertains to this is that in Asia, there is a notion there, like the philosophy of Asian thought is that once something goes to an extreme, it changes to its opposite. I mean, this is a very, very simple premise the whole basis of yin and yang, right? The dark side of the mountain, the sunny side of the mountain, night, day, right? The alternating rhythms of the cycles of life and nature. This is something we're so divorced from in the West. And like, if a little is good, lots more must be better. And you see right now on every level of society that things have gone so far in one direction that you see it swinging back and turning into its opposite, even up to and including, right, the whole gender hysteria, right, that's taking place. It's like, well, men should pretend that they're women, and vice versa, and all this. It's like it's an extreme representation of exactly that principle in action. So I'm looking at thoughts there, but I see exactly what it is that you're describing. Is there a good or a bad way for the government to intervene at all, or is the problem, like with fiat currency, just that, like, is there a scenario where the government just stops intervening in life, in our lifetime?
Well, it depends, like if we want economic growth, we can have endogenous economic growth, maybe for a cycle, or maybe related to some individual development that, let's say, raises the productivity of society to like a new level. But then at some point, all these things level off. You can't keep them on an upward trajectory forever. If we want GDP growth on an upward trajectory forever, the governments have to step in. That's just it. There's no two ways about that. Now, is there a good and a bad way for governments to intervene? I would wager that bottom-up intervention is much, much better than the top-down intervention. And here's the reason why. So if you splurge on ordinary people, then ordinary people are going to have, let's say, a more decent standard of living. They're going to have a certain level of prosperity and some money to spend. So even if you're a cold-hearted capitalist and you want to just build your business and grow your wealth, wouldn't that be easier if people in your community had money to spend, and then maybe some of them would become your patrons and come to your hotels or buy widgets from your factory or whatever it happens to be? And if you don't have that, then maybe those same people will be homeless bums on your street where your sons and daughters are walking to and from school on a daily basis. So what's better, if those people are your customers, or if those people are a social risk factor that could end up causing a tragedy in your family, and your business has no customers, and instead you have to kind of try to get government contracts because that's the only reliable paymaster in the whole economy.
What
And
about
then there's on the opposite end of the spectrum also is that if you splurge top down and you give a lot of money to large corporations, military industrial complexes and so on, then you run a very high risk of incubating fascism in society, because these corporations become enormously wealthy and powerful. They gain political influence. They lobby for more and more favors and legislation that favors them, and they start to gradually draw society away from being of the people and for the people, and it starts to become of the corporations and for the corporations. And we've seen that in the past, and you get things like IG Farben or today Rheinmetall and corporations like that suddenly start having a huge influence over the government. And then, like if their business is producing and selling weapons, then they might be vitally interested in getting the government to wage wars. Or if their business is producing and selling vaccines, then they might have great interest in getting the whole world onto some World Health Organization scheme where some bureaucrat can at his discretion declare a global pandemic, and then everybody has to be injected umpteen times with your corporation's products. So I would say that bottom up is a lot better, a lot less risky.
It's a good point.
Than top down, and that works not just for the ordinary people who benefit from the government largesse, it's also good for the capitalists, because if you're going to be running a business, then in one case you have a lot of a market of people with money to spend,
actual money,
and in the other case, all you have to do is like you're competing at the government trough, and
right.
eventually you end up absorbed and squeezed out by the biggest. I don't know, 20 years ago, the U.S. military industrial complex had 50 major contractors that were on the approved list of the Pentagon. Today, there's only 5. And the other 45 got squeezed out or absorbed or taken over.
That's right. That's right. Well, so it's a compelling argument, for a guy like me, right? And so the bottom up thing makes sense. But what about, like, is it possible to live in a world, and could it be, and like, one of the things that's happening is the internet and the whole, it's very hard for the government to pull off the kind of lies that they've used all throughout history. It's just it's so hard to plug all the holes where people can get information, like podcasts, for example, right? You can try to shut it down, you can try to censor people, you can try to kick people off the internet and all the rest, but in the end, right, there are ways for people to think and to speak and to communicate and for messages to get out. And that's partly what we're seeing. Martin Gurry did that great book, The Revolt of the Public and the Crisis of Authority in the 21st Century. And he was dead on. And that was like pre-Trump. He really nailed what was coming. And so, what about a world in which, I mean, my question back to you on that from a anarcho-capitalist point of view is, like, the government produces nothing. The government has everything they have because they take it from productive people. What about a world in which they're neither giving to the bottom up or the top down? Like, is that still possible? Are we past the point where governments are going to back off enough to just leave everyone alone and allow us to operate the way we want to in the West? Is that a pipe dream at this point?
Well, it depends on what we want. I think that's possible. Of course, we can organize life of our societies in the future whichever way we want. We have to just kind of work out what we want. If in certain senses, government has a legitimate role to play, and if I would give you a simplified illustration of that, you can think of a transition from a low productivity society to a high productivity society. Let's say, if you look at a society of, let's say, a nomadic tribe, they move about the earth with their goats or sheep or whatever they have, and pretty much the whole community contributes to the community sustenance, maybe except for the very, very elderly or babies. And everybody's doing something. And so it takes pretty much the whole community to produce sustenance for the community. And then let's say if they settle down and they start developing agriculture, and now at some point, when they learn agriculture, they become much more productive and they start to generate a surplus. And that means that, maybe not everybody has to work to produce the sustenance for the community. So now you have surplus labor in the community. And so the possibility of having surplus labor means that you can allocate this labor on something that is not an essential and a necessity, but would be nice, like, I don't know, building a bridge across the river. So you can say, like, right, let's say there's a squad of men who are not going to be working the fields, they're not going to be hunting, they're just going to go and build the bridge. Okay, so that means that somebody in this society has to decide to allocate a portion of the surplus to these men and their families, because they're not going to be contributing to that surplus, but the community wants the bridge. So that's a political decision, which legitimately belongs with the community, right? And it could be whatever, clearing another patch of the forest to add to the productive field. So what ends up happening is that you have surplus, and then you invest that surplus into some new piece of social infrastructure that then in turn makes the community even more productive and even more wealthy, generates even more surplus, gives it even more options to build, new things, pyramids, cathedrals, spaceships, whatever. And it's always a political decision how this surplus is going to be invested. What do we want? So, at a certain level in a small community, maybe everybody can come to the town square and cast their vote and make the decision. But at some point, there's going to have to be like representatives, consulting specialists, making projections. What is this piece of infrastructure going to mean? How it's going to impact us? Blah, blah, blah. So, there's a role for coordinating all this thinking and allocating and analyzing and projecting. And, a government is not necessarily an evil. And so long as the government is allocating our social surplus, like our existing productivity, there's no evil in government allocating that on our behalf. Like if it really is a government of the people, for the people, and of the people, by the people,
yes,
then that can be a good thing. And especially if you design effective means of controlling the government, calling it to account, and so forth. The problem is in our societies that this has been largely eviscerated, done away with. The accountability has been practically lost. The control, the regulation has all been deliberately destroyed. And so now naturally you have the reaction that some people just don't want government anywhere in any role. They want to do away with it. But if we do away with government altogether, then we're devolving to tribal societies, where still you're going to have some form of, you're going to have to have a chieftain, some strongman who's going to...
Some kind of hierarchy emerges.
Yeah, you're going to have at the very minimum, you're going to have mechanism for resolution of conflict.
Right.
And then, what happens if we devolve to that level? Then, you might come into a conflict with your next tribe because maybe you use the river to cultivate fish.
Yeah.
And maybe upstream somebody decides to put in a paper mill that's going to contaminate and kill all your fish. So what are you going to do? Go to war against? Like in nature, there's this really, really robust process with a track record going back, I don't know, billions of years, where simpler particles have a very strong, irresistible tendency to combine with other particles to form larger structures. Subatomic particles form atoms, which form molecules, which form organic molecules.
There's a self-organizing principle built into nature. Yeah,
exactly. So you always have a tendency for things to coalesce into larger and larger structures. And so eventually, we can see that with humanity, that, like we're all individuals, but we combine in families and in tribes and in clans and in nations. And so I think the natural way for us is to continue this, but it has to come bottom up, because in nature, all this healthy combining goes bottom up. All the decisions are made not top down by some, authority, but by individual agents who combine on the logic of what makes sense to them. And so I think that if we upgrade the operating system of society, and we incentivize these healthy forces coming bottom up, and we disable these top-down forces where we are ruled by, I don't even know what, occult oligarchy, then we could build healthy societies without having to devolve to, tribalism again.
So let's depart the philosophical for a second, because one of the other things, of course, and I want people to know about this, sign up for Alex's Trend Compass. Yeah, is the name of your journal. it's really excellent. It's really, really good. And so what are the trends then with respect to, whether it's top down, bottom up? I mean, obviously the US was a great example of an experiment where government was limited and people were allowed to do their own thing. And they had this tremendous bottom up swell of creativity and productivity that went on for roughly, 200 plus years. We're in some ways in the twilight of it, but maybe it's possible that good times really will come again. It's possible that the people who appear to be in control, or at least believe that they're in control, actually aren't, right? Which is partly where I'm coming from. And that the whole thing, without going over the edge, could have a kind of renaissance, right? If we get some fresh ideas and some better thinking about the way things could or should be run, we certainly have enough resource and know-how and technology and all the rest to see something really good happen. But what do you see? Like, what are the trends that you and your people are betting on, either with respect to the way the West is headed, or the US in particular, or Europe? I know, obviously, you're in Europe. What do you see? Like, where are the trends now, and what do you see coming?
Oh, well, it's a lot, but I think it's very important to recognize that we are coming to a head with respect to a system of governance which has pretty much shaped the Western civilization for the past, depending on how you measure it, at the very least, past 500 years, and if you want, you can say the past almost 3,000 years. And so we are 19th April on, I think just yesterday, you had Boris Johnson, probably had one too many drinks, record a little short video and posted it on Twitter. And he said, if the West loses in Ukraine, it's going to be an absolute catastrophe. It's going to be the end of Western hegemony. Okay.
And why is that, Boris? Right? Will you interpret that? Because I know you have a lot to say about what's happening in Europe and Ukraine and Russia and all the rest. Is that what he's referring to, specifically?
Yeah. This is what he's referring to. Well, the Western hegemony means that this system of governance that we've been under for the last 500 years is coming to an end. It's actually losing two different systems of governance. And the same thing was, Polish Prime Minister Mateusz Morawiecki said the almost exact same thing about a year or two ago. He said that if the West loses in Ukraine, the West will lose the world for a generation, and it will be the end of the golden age of the Western world. Okay, so we have to qualify this. What does that mean? Does that mean that things are going to get really bad for you and me? Not so much, not necessarily, but the hegemony of the Western world, basically, when you peel the onions all the way to its essence, to its core, what you discover is that it is the hegemony of the Western financial oligarchy, which has been able to gradually gain political and military control over much of the rest of the world, colonize it, and exploit it for its resources and for its labor, so that by extracting the resources of all these colonized nations around the world, they could trade them through their own banking establishments and turn them into financial flows that basically constituted like a massive conveyor belt, transferring wealth from everywhere across the world to the financial centers like New York, London, Paris, Frankfurt, and so forth.
Yep.
And to the banking institutions that are dominated by, let's say, a handful of families in the West, who then had, dominance over the political systems domestically, over the media and everything. And we all kind of went along with it because some of that wealth did trickle down to the ordinary Westerner. But this has now come to an end, and you can see how the cities in the West, the United States, France, Britain, they're full of homeless people. People are struggling to make ends meet. It's really grinding to a halt, and by losing militarily in places like Ukraine, the Middle East, Afghanistan, large swathes of Africa, they're losing control of those regions' collateral. They can no longer turn it into financialized flows in the West, which means that they can, like their wealth conveyor belt is breaking down. And not only that, but militarily they find themselves so weak that they are unable to reverse this collapse. And so this is why they're panicking and they're saying like, oh my God, this is going to be catastrophic and we're going to lose our hegemony. The reason they say this is because they are losing their hegemony.
Correct. Yeah.
But
and that it is the sort of oligarchic faction in the West that stands to lose the most. I mean, these people will be the big losers. Will it impact regular people's lives? Maybe.
Yes.
We've lived on the cheap, right? In the U.S., obviously, like we send paper to Germany and they send Mercedes, and it's obviously a very good trade and has been for all of my lifetime, right?
Yeah, but Tane, if you wanted to buy a Mercedes, you still had to pay for it. You still had to earn those dollars to pay for the Mercedes. So to you and I, it makes very little difference in the end because, in fact, I would say like to us, it makes a positive difference because the fact that, today something like 100 million new people are becoming, coming into the level of affluence worldwide.
Yep.
That means that if you have something to sell as an entrepreneur, the market of affluent people who might be able to be your customers is growing.
Yes.
The people who lose pretty much everything, their whole system implodes like a house of cards, are exactly these banking oligarchies and these mega corporations that they control.
Yep.
Because they can no longer, impose the terms of trade, and they can no longer say like, hey, guess what? You're going to have to sell me your oil for this paper that I'm going to give you.
Right.
To you and I, it's the same. You want to go to get a tank of gas on the gas station, you have to pay it. And it doesn't matter whether you pay to Exxon or you pay to Gazprom or you pay to an Iranian company or a Mexican company.
Yeah, it really is a panic of the ruling class in the West.
Yes, exactly. It's a panic of the ruling class.
And it's a panic with at least the optionality that they're going to absolutely throw a fit, right? That they're going to have a complete tantrum. And so my understanding of, and this is where I want to go with this, like the war in Ukraine is over as far as I can read between the lines. And again, it's very hard to know what's going on. But for years, obviously the lying mainstream media has said one thing. You always had to be very suspicious of it. How is Russia really going to lose to this country? I don't think anybody who's followed, say, any YouTube videos of Douglas McGregor, for example, these people have been very outspoken, like, no, the Russians are doing just fine. And in fact, it's really helped war is never good for an economy because it's so wasteful, but they've really retooled their thinking. And these people they're not fighting for profit. Like they're fighting for their existence. They understand, Putin understands that obviously his back is to the wall. I mean, obviously the West would love to carve Russia up and steal a bunch of resources. Russia is the biggest prize of all when it comes to natural resources.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And so where is that situation at? What do you see coming next? I know you had something to say, and I want to weave the book on Bill Browder into this because it's like you saw all of this coming, right? And you wrote about it in a way that actually pissed off people enough that they shut you down and banned your book, which you should be very proud of.
Yes, it's become a badge of honor. Yeah,
yes,
thank
absolutely.
you. Well, I think that the military conflict in Ukraine is drawing to a close, and I think that you're right. The lying media has been lying to us about this conflict all along since its very beginning. Not just about the special military operation that started in February 22, they've been lying about it since 2014 and before that, because the first color revolution there, the Orange Revolution, happened in 2004 already. Yep. Ukraine has always been taken as the potential bludgeon to be used against Russia, and the West has constantly been eager to intervene in Ukraine to exactly fashion it into that kind of a bludgeon. Well, now their bludgeon is broken. And the Russians, are not interested in pursuing other nations militarily. So they're not interested in expanding the war to Poland and Germany and France and England and
got a lot of
Spain and
land to take
Portugal
care of
and God
already.
knows where.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, they already have the largest country in the world. They're already doing well. They want to feel secure in their country, and that's the objective of the Ukraine war. However, the conflict, which remember, in its broadest context, the conflict which is between the two systems of governance will not end at that point.
Right.
There will still be this Western colonialist, oligarchic, imperialistic system of governance that's not just going to walk quietly into the night. It's going to continue trying to win back some of its hegemony in whichever way, in whichever region, against China, in the Middle East, in Africa, in South America,
yeah, right.
wherever they can, wherever there's resources to be had, they will agitate. And so the conflict continues, but I think that from the point of view of Russia and China, the conflict will probably continue more in diplomatic and legal ways. And here's what I mean by that. The Western jurisdictions that are, let's say, where most of our trade in dollar terms and euro terms flows, have been, about 30 of them have enacted the so-called Magnitsky legislation, Magnitsky Act. It started in 2012 in the United States with the U.S. Magnitsky Act, which was lobbied through the U.S. Congress by a man named Bill Browder. So Bill Browder used to work as a manager of the largest foreign-owned hedge fund in Russia during the 1990s, while Russia was undergoing transition from, quote unquote, from communism to capitalism, which in fact was one of the largest pirate raids organized by Western financial interests on a sovereign nation ever recorded. It was absolutely massive.
Yeah.
And so, as a consequence of all that, Russians have literally hundreds of investigative files about the assets that were taken out of Russia and that disappeared through offshore financial centers, like Switzerland, Cyprus, Delaware, through London, through Ireland, and various other jurisdictions. And so Russians are, and that includes even things like literally hundreds of paintings taken out of Russian museums and sent to, who knows where, who knows whom. And Russians want to trace these assets back. And so what happens is that Bill Browder, who was, participated in this plunder of Russia during the 1990s, and he wasn't just some guy owning some fund. His partner in crime was Edmund Safra's Republic National Bank of New York. And then after Edmund Safra's death, that bank got absorbed by HSBC. And so now his political backing still is HSBC. And HSBC is enormously powerful in Great Britain, but also in other Western jurisdictions. And so I think that with the Magnitsky Act, which is ostensibly like a human rights legislation, supposedly they want to punish people who infringe on human rights, like Russian officials who break the human rights of Russian people. That's the ostensible justification for the act. The reality is that it was designed to become like an impregnable barrier between Western jurisdictions and first the Russian, let's say, law enforcement, but then also it expanded to any, they can now do this with any country. They expanded it from just targeting Russia to now targeting pretty much any country that they choose. And so what that did is that it made it literally impossible for Russian investigators, for their police, for their diplomats to come to London or New York or Cyprus or Switzerland and file lawsuits and then start deposing witnesses and participants and getting the local law firms and investigators to, because what happens then is then you start to create a paper trail, and these depositions and these witness statements, they become part of the record. And then with a process that may take a long time, you could actually follow the money and trace it to its ultimate beneficial owners. So you could then establish exactly who was the greatest beneficiary of this mass plunder of Russia. And then you get to the top of the oligarchic command and control hierarchy in the West, and then you can dismantle it, because you can start demanding accountability for these people and exposing their crimes. And so this is what Magnitsky Act pretty much disabled. And so I think that for Russia and China, once the Ukraine war is over, there will be diplomatic pressure for Western jurisdictions to start overturning this Magnitsky legislation. And then they will probably be pursuing all these investigation files until they find the culprits, which will be their actual enemies by name. And so I feel that this is how the Russians and the Chinese, and probably Indians as well, and Iranians and maybe Egyptians, maybe this is going to be like a whole BRICS gang up on these Western oligarchs. And this way they will dismantle this system of governance, which has been their enemy. And, we have to watch out, because they will try to convince us that the Russians are coming against us and we are being targeted and blah, blah, blah. But it's, we have to be careful. They will try to use us as human shields.
That's right.
And they will start trying to convince us that we are all together in this, we and our oligarchs, we're all buddy pals, they will not only that, they will try very hard to push us into war against Russia.
Yep.
And
what is the likelihood of that succeeding? I know you maybe you have a better answer than other people, but based on your experience, your lived experience, because that's exactly what I see. And what is the likelihood that they can throw a Hail Mary pass and, like, you see, Russia attacked us with a false flag or whatever kind of contrivance could be ginned up at this point? What is the likelihood of something like that actually going down? Do you have any sense?
Well, yeah, if history is any guide, the likelihood is very considerable, because, I like to point out that, Ukraine, which has now been absolutely devastated with as many as 500,000 men sacrificed in this war against Russia, there was no hatred of Russia in Ukraine prior to any of this. Even after the coup in the first elections, these Russophobic extreme right parties like Svoboda and the right sector, they won in 2014. They won, the two of them together won 1.6% of the popular vote, which means that they were extremely unpopular. And even in 2019, Zelensky was swept into power with 73% of the vote, because he was promising peace with Russia, normalization, and re-legalization of the Russian language. So that's what the people of Ukraine wanted. And also, there was a poll in Ukraine done in February 22, so just literally days before the beginning of the special military operation and the war in Ukraine, asking people if they would be willing to take up arms to defend Ukraine against Russia. And nationwide, only 16% of the people said yes. So people were not interested in having a war against Russia. And so today, we in the West, we might feel kind of complacent and secure because nobody's interested in going to war against Russia. But we can see that our politicians all of a sudden, on cue, started talking about war economy, about conscription, about militarization, about threat from Russia, about the coming war against Russia, and blah, blah, blah. And so the narrative has already started where it was in Ukraine 10 years ago. And now watch what happens later. So suddenly a lot of credit is flowing into the military corporations in Germany, in France, in England, in Britain, and so forth. And now, the propaganda is going to follow, and they're going to continue trying to create this mass formation psychosis about the coming war on Russia, as though it's an inevitable thing. The Russians are coming. The Russians are coming. And then they're going to start these, stormtroops, the little brown shirt movements, which in fact already exist. They're going to start becoming more and more visible. And we might see the exact same progression that we saw in 1930s in Germany and that we saw starting 10 years ago in Ukraine, which eventually becomes its own realization, its own self-fulfilling prophecy. And so for Ukrainians who are not interested in this war, today it's gotten to the point where these brown shirt movements are now sweeping men off the streets in Ukraine and tossing them into the trenches in the Eastern Front. And, now you have these hundreds of thousands of graves of Ukrainian flags. And if we don't push back against this, it could be the same with Polish flags, with Croatian flags, with German flags, with Romanian flags. But, the oligarchy in power is driving us in this direction. And so historical precedents are not encouraging, but I'm still optimistic because I think that today the Western establishment has lost its credibility.
Yeah.
And I think that today people are looking at these developments with a far more critical eye. We had the pandemic of 2020, which really changed things radically. The conspiracy theories went from the loony fringe to a considerable percentage of the society, and people see where this is all going. And so I think that what we have to do is we have to keep speaking out. We have to keep pushing back. We have to keep finding ways to seed the system with 100 million points of friction and arrest the progression. And we have to understand that our banking oligarchies, when they say we this, we that, that's not the we that we think.
Who's this we, Kimosabi? Yeah, exactly. That's a fascinating take. And, because you're a finance guy too, I'm really curious, your best guess at how likely it is to succeed, that the Western oligarchy can hold this whole thing together. They are discredited at a much greater level than ever before in my lifetime, although I was fairly jaded and cynical, right? Even as a young man, for me, everything, whether it came out of bitterness just from, normal, teenage sort of angst toward the world. But I always looked at sort of the way that my earliest memories, even when I was, 5, 6, 7 years old, I remember having thoughts along the lines of, and I couldn't clearly articulate it at the time, but it was very clear to me. It's the people running the institutions are the problem, and they're there because they claim this institutional kind of authority, almost like divine right of kings. Well, we're in charge of the institution. I'm your teacher. What I'm saying has to be correct because I'm the person in charge of the institution. And my thought for that all the time was but there's something that doesn't add up there. The whole idea of America, It was but if you have a better way, right, you actually get to surpass people who are sort of blocking progress. And all of that's largely been, it's not that it's gone, but it's so I guess this is really my question for you, Alex, if I can articulate it this way. The pendulum swings. We're watching a big historical pendulum swing right now, but does it go all the way to, the wreckage of, everything great that the West has built up? Because obviously it's been pretty good for a long time. Or is there a moment where it hits and stops? I know you mentioned this. You said this too. This is also a very controversial kind of thing to say. there could very easily come November or January, right, be a detente with Russia where somebody new comes to power. Now, I wish Trump would just go away. I really do. But this is what we're stuck with right now. These two octogenarians fighting over who's going to drive us into the ground first. But obviously, one of the things that could happen, potentially could happen, right? And God knows what's going to happen between now and November is the whole thing with Russia just goes away. Right? I mean, it is possible. I know a lot of the establishment is very vested in making sure that that doesn't happen, and hence all the war rhetoric and, you know, idiots like Boris Johnson, right, saying like, well, you should sign up. If we have to fight, you know, you should do this. It's like, no, right? Absolutely. That's, you know, you should not sign up. And I hope everybody gives him the middle finger on the way out the door. But is there a chance? What is the likelihood that the pendulum stops or swings back? And it's like there's some kind of semblance of, hey, but we're wise to your game and we're not playing with it. I mean, I think it's quite high. And my own feeling is that it's going to be hard to get people to go along with. There's been so much lying and deception for so long now in our society, certainly in the United States. And I don't count myself as representative of the general population by a long shot. But I do think that it's going to be very hard to keep people on board with this kind of narrative. I think there's too many things that just don't add up at this point. Your thoughts?
Yeah, I tend to very much agree with you. I think that all the people that feel a sense of purpose, that have, you know, like, so to speak, the fire in their belly, are people who are strongly against this, strongly against the establishment, strongly against the war, strongly against this system of governance. And people who are lukewarm, undetermined, lost and confused are the people that they have to try to mobilize in order to get things going their way. And so, you know, as I like to put it metaphorically, their levers of power have all turned into wet noodles. And I think that even you know, the social technology of fomenting mass formation psychosis is not going to work so well this time around, because they lost that bullet as well. They fired off that bullet. Next time it's not going to work as well. So even, you know, like, I see that even when they attempt false flag attacks, many people are wise to it, so they don't happen, or they don't produce the effect that they intended it to produce. You know, the opposing powers, the adversarial powers like Russia and China and Iran, they are wise to all these things, so they don't bite into provocations. They don't react to provocations. They attack asymmetrically in ways that cannot easily be ascribed to them. And so, and then, you know, there's another thing, is that as this whole process of defense loses coherence, you know, defense of the system loses coherence, it also loses their competent people. You know, like, there's almost like a robust process where competent people are kind of falling down on the hierarchy.
Yes.
And incompetent people keep rising to the top. So, you know, you're supposed to carry on this millennial epic war for the preservation of your system, but you have to rely on increasingly less competent, less capable men and women, and you see that they're bungling up more and more and more things.
Yep.
Even to the point where it's embarrassing when you learn how certain things failed, you realize that these were really incompetent people who were in charge, and that's why the thing failed, because it didn't necessarily have to fail.
Right.
You know, like the withdrawal from Afghanistan, the whole operation in Afghanistan, the recent events in the Middle East, you know, like the Israeli attack on Iranian consulate in Damascus, and then Iranian retribution and how it all played out. And then when you listen to people, Douglas McGregor and Scott Ritter, who have looked into these events in detail, you realize that people in charge of Western forces really were way, way out of their depth. And so in operation after operation, in project after project, you keep kind of like going into bigger and bigger drawdown. And then your own public at home is less and less on board. The more they see, the less they are on board.
Yep.
So I tend to share your optimism, but I think we have to be still very much on edge. We have to be on our toes because it's not the question of whether they are capable of winning or not. I think they're not. But it's the question of how much damage they're going to inflict on our societies in the process. And, you know, like Emmanuel Macron, look at him. It's like the whole world is screaming at him that sending French troops to Ukraine is a really bad idea. And there's nothing to gain other than getting those men killed. There's not a theoretical chance for them to turn around the course of this war. That's clear. Everybody understands this. Even he understands this. But nevertheless, he goes through with it all the same. And he sends like 150 foreign legionaries to Ukraine.
Did they send troops? I didn't know that.
Yeah. Apparently they sent troops, and something like 40 of them got wiped out yesterday in a missile attack on their hotel somewhere in eastern Ukraine. And so, you know, it seems to me like it's a panic because they're doing things, you know, like you're fighting a fight that you're not going to lose, but that you know you're going to lose, but you fight it anyway because you don't know what else to do.
You don't know what else to do. Yeah. They're so used to talking shit and being and actually having an effect where they intimidate people, and they're able to sort of bluff their way out of various, what is essentially like a very, very bad hand. And now the hand is so bad and it's so clear, right, that the West is holding so few cards. I mean, I'm with you. I mean, the nagging question that I still have is like, how bad is it really in the US right now? This thing about the crisis of competence that you describe at every level. People in the business world, which is where I spend most of my time, 9 to 5, business owners, you know, anything from, I sat next to a mechanic on the plane in Alaska last year while we were jumping from island to island. The realization and the recognition that there just aren't any good people to take over. You can't, like, you could sell your business and maybe you sell it to a private equity firm and get a, you know, reasonable multiple, but you're not going to sell it to somebody who's coming up who's really competent at taking it over, because there is nobody. Right. But that realization, like all over the country in all different industries, disciplines, you know, walks of life, where like the schools and everything have been so bad for so long. Now you're starting to see the evil fruit of all of this dumbing down. And like I said about my experience in grad school in San Francisco, this low common denominator, like we're going to cater to that so that nobody is upset, so that nobody's offended, so that nobody is, you know, sort of left behind, which, you know, on the surface, you know, you would say is that's a really generous thing, that like Americans are like ill with this kind of mentality more than most other people, but it's obviously been weaponized into, and therefore if you're better, you're the enemy, right? And now you see what all of that has done. But I guess we're all going to find out together the answer to the question just how bad things really are, because I do feel like the curtain's going to get pulled back, and you really are going to see there's a helicopter going over. I'm not sure if it's super noisy from your end, but
no, I can't really hear it.
Can't hear it? Well, here it comes. But it is truly disturbing. It is truly shocking. And to think that we're going to live through the time when the final envelope is going to be open, and it's like, here's how bankrupt the culture actually is, or the opposite, which is like, yeah, it was bad, there's no question, but these ideas are really fucking stupid and they're finished. And we're going to put some people back in who will like actually believe in diplomacy and, you know, believe that sound money might be a good thing to reintroduce. I didn't even get to ask you about, I think gold could be remonetized. I don't know if you have views on this. I think the whole financial system may, because of what China and Russia are doing and the BRICS are doing, that there may be a moment when the U.S. actually has to remonetize gold as well. But maybe we save that for another talk. I want to be respectful of your time as well. That's a super fascinating take.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, look, I think that in the end, good things define the times, because if you go back to periods like before World War II, before and after World War One, the Civil War in the United States, the 1920s depression, and so forth, like all of those episodes were chock full of bad things and nonsense and incompetent people and idiots and errors and mistakes and deliberate cock-ups. And in the end, we come through it, and something from every crisis, something good emerges. So there are good, clever, competent people with high integrity today all around us who are going to get in charge of some aspect of life: business, government, diplomacy, military, and so on. And they're gonna turn things around. They're gonna contribute to improvements and good solutions. And I think that particularly in the United States, which has a less ossified social hierarchy, meaning that people are less attached to who went to which school and who belongs to which family than is the case in European societies. I think that transformation will probably be a lot more vibrant in the United States than it will be on the European continent. So I kind of tend to feel, even though I'm European and I live in Europe and so forth, I tend to feel a lot more optimistic about the future of the United States than I feel about the future of the old continent. I think that for many of us, it's going to come to a question of emigrating west to the United States, or maybe emigrating east to Russia or somewhere like that.
I know people doing it already. We have a
Yeah.
in our group who went essentially from Ontario to Russia as well. So, my friend, that's probably a good place for us to wrap up. And any other specific advice, like for the individual watching this, what should you do? What's the number one tip from Alex Krainer to sort of prepare for? Let's say if you got to prepare for the worst case scenario, what should somebody really be thinking about and putting their effort into if times really get ugly in the years ahead?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And I think that, like a few days ago, our good friend Doug Casey wrote an excellent article that people need to invest in their own skills. But, you also have to ask yourself what skills, because it won't do to become like to get a degree in gender studies, obviously. But, you have to acquire skills that can make you useful to a community. And I think that therein lies maybe the most important line of defense for anybody, which is cultivating your connections and your bonds with your local community. Because the day Walmart doesn't open, or your bank ATM machine fails, or your government doesn't respond, your social support network is going to be people who live around you. And that can be so enormously powerful, because if you know that your neighbor, one of your neighbors knows how to fix cars, that another one of your neighbors knows how to fix your internet, or your leaky roof, or your fridge, or another neighbor knows how to fix teeth, or is a doctor or a nutritionist. If you live in a house in a community of maybe 100, 150 households, believe me, all of the basic requirements for survival are already there.
Yep.
Even if everything else collapses, you're going to do okay. Now, but you need to know the people, and you need to cultivate these bonds of trust and community with them. And, another very important signal that's exactly where the most important defense lies is, in my experience, I participated in a little conference called Think Local in Ireland. I was invited as a speaker. This was organized by 5 very ordinary, law-abiding Irish professionals. Nothing political about them. They were not members of some party. They were not radicals. They were not ideologically oriented people. Just ordinary people who wanted to organize a local get-together where local people could meet one another, talk, discuss have a few speakers to stimulate the discussion. Well, the Irish government went out of their way to prevent this get together from happening. This was in February 23.
It's just fucking crazy,
Insane, but
crazy.
Insane how far they went to make sure it didn't happen. In the end, they managed to organize it, but just barely. And then they planned the next get together in July of last year, so last summer. And I was unfortunately not able to go. But anyway, this time the government succeeded and prevented the conference from happening.
Wow.
What did they do? They sent spies around to find out which venues they were planning to use for this conference. And then they kind of intimidated the venue owners and managers to cancel the event, to say like, no, you will not host this event. And then one venue after another would say like, I'm very sorry people, but we cannot host your event. So that if the governments are that eager to prevent a get together of local law-abiding ordinary citizens to come together for a weekend and socialize and talk to one another, then that this is exactly what we need to be doing.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
They want us to be helpless.
That's right.
They want us to be completely dependent on government agencies and government bureaucrats, and they don't want us to know our neighbors. They don't want us to understand that we can do without the government if push comes to shove.
Right. Well, wouldn't that be the day? Well, that's obviously that's very chilling. I hope they held it and just didn't tell anybody about it. It's in my fantasy. That's what they did. But and Ireland so prosperous after such a short period of really tremendous reform and growth, and then to hear that and to see that, it's insane. It's one of the real benefits of living here in Puerto Rico is the government is so absolutely incompetent. Like there's no possibility they could put a stop to anything like that. So it's a real benefit of being here, and mostly folks they're into community. Like there's gatherings here all the time. So it's exactly what I'm trying to do.
Oh, beautiful. Yeah.
Exactly what I'm absolutely involved in right now. So my friend, thank you very much. That was really excellent.
Thank you, Tang. It was a pleasure for me.
It was great to meet you in Dubai and really great to have you on. And obviously I hope we get to do it again soon, and we'll have something even more outrageous to talk about, I'm sure, by the next time.
With pleasure. Time, thank you. Enjoy Puerto Rico, and we'll reconnect again soon.
I'll see you soon. Yep, that's it for me, everybody. Thanks again, Alex. And head over to expatfiles.org for more good stuff and to sign up for something over there. Okay, thanks very much. Have a good one.